More witnesses took to the stand in the trial that will determine who controls Jackson's airport in the months and years to come. Investigative reporter CJ LeMaster wraps up the trial's first week, and tell us what you can, CJ.
Well, Courtney Ann, despite the state's claim that the Jackson Medgar Wiley Evers International Airport was struggling financially and needed to be taken over, its own words from a memo that was introduced in court 11 years ago, testimony today showed that those concerns never materialized in helping the facility financially. Here's what we're talking about. Former Governor Phil Bryant's chief of staff, Joey Sonji, testified that the governor never tried to get money for the airport from 2013 to 2016. The airport board's CEO, Rosa Beckett, also told the court that in recent years, that trend has continued with the exception of this year. Lawmakers appropriated $500,000 as a local match grant for the airport to get millions in federal dollars. But Governor Tate Reeves, as you may remember from our reporting, vetoed that item this year, claiming on a social media post the airport wasted millions on lawyer fees for this case, and he didn't want to give any taxpayer money to help it. Well, Sonji also mentioned pitching the idea of the airport restructuring to several stakeholders, but admitted in court he didn't seek out any opinions from JMAA, the city of Jackson, or even Jackson's legislative delegation. Beckett told the court that those grants are critically important because the airport is supposed to be self-sustaining and cannot give any of its revenues to the city or other entities. She says even the largest airport in the world by volume, Atlanta, applies for federal grants. Finally, Jackson State political science professor DeAndre Ori argued that Senate Bill 2162 reflected a historical pattern of racial bias in the legislature that dilutes voting power and undermines the independence of municipalities managed by African Americans. Now, the state moved to try and strike Ori's testimony and study from the record just moments before court adjourned for the day, claiming he didn't give proper context when these instances of racial animus were chosen. U.S. District Judge Carlton Reeves reserved the right to rule on it at a later time, but made no decision today. Meanwhile, the state will bring its witnesses forward next week. Courtney Ann.